Hello and welcome back to this Downfall Idealistic Crusade. This video will be a review of a book I long awaited and pored over to savor every last moment of it. And that's of course Joseph McBride's latest critical / biographical work, this time on the legend Billy Wilder, entitled Dancing on the Edge, which is a perfect title for a book on Wilder's life and career. This is in the same sort of style that McBride has always sort of followed, and this one in particular may be a little bit more on the academic side. So if you're looking for a pure Wilder biography, this is probably not the best place to start. This is definitely, I will fully admit, this is a book for hardcore Wilder fans and nerds like myself and many others. It is a rumination, a book that tries to get under the skin of the person and their work and find parallels between their life and their work, as McBride does with absolute skill, which it has made him really one of my favorite, if not my favorite, film biographer. Of course, he has done many fantastic works. I think his book, Searching for John Ford, is the great John Ford book, and it all started really with his essential book, Catastrophe of Success, on Frank Capra, really puncturing the sort of self-promoted Capra mythology that Capra really started to heavily promote and stick to in his later years, especially after his autobiography, Name Above the Title. So if you've ever read McBride's book on Capra, you know the links he goes to in really putting his subjects under the microscope, but always in a fair and balanced way. I also have always appreciated how his books have a sort of feel of having a dialogue with someone. You really get that in his Wilder book, and while you may not agree with all the points he has, and in particular his views on some films you may not agree with fully, it's again this sort of feeling of having a dialogue that you're never able to have with another person at this length and detail on Wilder. And for the most part, I find myself, just nodding along with his reading of most of Wilder's film. Well, actually, pretty much all his readings of Wilder's films, especially titles that are very much neglected, especially in the latter half of Wilder's career, which is woefully not appreciated, particularly once he switched over to working with his second and longest collaborator, I.A.L. Diamond, who was also a genius and isn't given enough credit. But the later films post The Apartment and Irma la Douce of the mid to late 60s and into the 70s, in the twilight years of Wilder's career, before he was completely just shunted aside for the last 20 some odd years of his life after the failure of his last picture, Buddy Buddy, which is still not readily available on home video, unfortunately. It's one of the great shames of Hollywood that Wilder was treated this way. The greatest writer-director who ever lived was stuck with nothing to do but eventually go further into art collecting and painting, and of course giving endless interviews, but he couldn't get a picture made, which is just absolutely insane. But he made many great underrated gems and classics and masterworks in his later career. They were just a bit different. They were seen as getting old and passé at the time. And ironically, in a lot of ways, he followed Hitchcock in that same sort of thing. So their careers sort of went on an interesting path after their great hit successes at the end of the 50s and start of the 60s. Hitchcock had North by Northwest and Psycho and The Birds. Wilder had Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, and Irma la Douce, and then both wound up making films that were seen as failures in 1964. Hitchcock had Marnie, and Wilder had Kiss Me Stupid, which became a debacle with the Legion of Decency and many critics and people and audiences saying it was, the dirtiest film ever made and deplorable, and it didn't even really get a proper official studio release because United Artists dumped it. And then, like Hitchcock, Wilder's career never really regained the same box office attraction potential that he'd had before, but he still kept making really intricate films, again like Hitchcock, and I think both made at least one more masterpiece in their later years. Hitchcock with Frenzy, and Wilder with The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which was an absolute epic, and unfortunately was butchered. I still think it's a masterpiece in its butchered form. It was conceived as a roadshow film, but I also feel the same way about Avanti, which is a great film, and McBride goes into both of those in detail, along with other truly underrated Wilder films like Fedora, and A Foreign Affair, which is another masterpiece. I do appreciate that he goes into details on the well-known films and the iconic films like Some Like It Hot and The Apartment and Ace in the Hole and Sunset Boulevard and Double Indemnity, but goes into details and tries to get at facets that haven't been covered 5 million times. And of course, being a Wilder nerd, I've read just about every book there is on Wilder. I think the essential books are, of course, the Conversations book he did with Cameron Crowe, which is, I think, is about as close to an autobiography as we ever will get from Wilder. And then in terms of the biography side, I think the best overall, if you want a legitimate, straightforward, typical biography in terms of how it's laid out, I think Ed Seekoff's On Sunset Boulevard, Life and Times of Billy Wilder, I think it's called, that's the great Wilder biography. What's great about what McBride does here is he doesn't discredit those works. He doesn't just completely ignore them. He builds upon them and makes constant references to other Wilder books, particularly Seekoff. But he builds upon them. So it's like building upon the foundations of what other people have already done, and it's bringing the study of Wilder forward. And again, making the case for the greatness of Wilder's work and career in both being a legendary screenwriter before he became a director, and of course becoming director, and of course also his writing partnerships with Charles Brackett and I.A.L. Diamond, two of the great, if not the greatest, screenwriting collaborations that have ever existed, and of course getting into Wilder's personal life. McBride does a really great job at getting into Wilder's childhood and early years in Europe, and then of course the rise of Hitler and the Nazis and what that meant for him and what that meant for all Jewish people, not just in Germany. And it's always interesting hearing Wilder recount stories and talk about his own experiences in various interviews, and then McBride sort of putting the historical facts behind that and sort of reading in further to what Wilder would say and his iconic famous anecdotes and things like that, and getting a greater sense of the pain and the guilt that Wilder and all the European emigres would carry with them through the rest of their Hollywood careers. Again, it's a perfect distillation of the various biographies, but again, it is not a traditional, straightforward biography. If you want to know more about Wilder and you haven't seen all of Wilder's films, or you're not too familiar with his other work outside of, say, Some Like It Hot and The Apartment and maybe Double Indemnity too, this is probably going to be a book you should read after at least reading Ed Seekoff's biography and maybe the Cameron Crowe book as well, because this is very much a level 10 hardcore Wilder fanatics only book, but it is the book I didn't know I needed. I was so excited to start reading this when I finally got it. I have savored every last page. I didn't want it to end. I could read a whole other book of this length, and this is a lengthy book. It clocks in at over 600 pages, so you definitely get your money's worth. It is a little pricey, but still not as expensive as some books from university presses can be. This is from Columbia University Press. It is done sort of in a similar style to McBride's last book, which he did on Ernst Lubitsch. So it's very fitting that he did the Lubitsch book and then went into the Wilder book, because, of course, Wilder was really the great disciple of Lubitsch. And for his entire life, he looked up to Lubitsch and had, even in his office, a famous sign made that said, "How would Lubitsch do it?" You can feel the influence of Lubitsch in Wilder's work, particularly in the films where he was really striving to try and equal the famous Lubitsch touch. But Wilder had his own sensibilities. He was always branded a cynic, and McBride does a really fantastic job at getting past that typical idea that you'll always see ascribed to Wilder, and really getting to the heart of his work, which is really more of a bruised romanticism. You can always feel a deep heart in Wilder's work, and that is what fuels the cynicism. You can see how humanity can be and should be, if everyone could be a mensch, as it's said in The Apartment. But of course, very few people will ever achieve that. That's why probably if I had to choose the one Wilder film to encompass his career, it would be The Apartment. I think that's the film where he most found his own particular viewpoint and style and balanced the darkness with the light. And the whole film is a gray area. Wilder is the master of gray areas. That's why I like to personally say, if you've ever seen which I'm sure you have, all the various shirts and posters that cheekily say something to the effect of, I learned everything I need to know, or everything about life from such and such. Well, I've always said, and I still feel this way, I personally learned everything I needed to know about life from Billy Wilder. I don't think there is a greater canon of works in the cinematic medium that better represent the various stages of life itself and this society that we have created, from the probing story of alcoholism and The Lost Weekend to the Raymond Chandler infused real birth of the film noir movement and Double Indemnity in 1944, to the absolute bleakest film Wilder ever made, the masterpiece Ace in the Hole, which bombed so badly that they retitled it, and then it still bombed, and it meant Wilder basically had to run for cover for the rest of the 1950s and never made anything quite as dark until he, kind of recovered his own box office tenure with Some Like It Hot and The Apartment. So personally, I find it impossible to choose a favorite Wilder film. There are so many, and so many underrated ones, and so many that I like to stick up for. I don't think he made a bad picture. Some people hate his remake of The Front Page, or they hate Buddy Buddy, which has a terrible reputation. Some people don't like Avanti. Some people don't like his early films. But I think he came out swinging right from his first feature as director with The Major and the Minor, which is a brilliant picture, which is completely full of wonderfully dark innuendos, and as Wilder said, it was basically like a proto-Lolita when you look at it, and it really is. And how that ever got past the censor boards, I will never know. But that was his first feature as a director, and I really appreciate the links at which McBride goes into really examining Wilder's early years as a screenwriter, most of which were doing bits of writing for films, as many writers would do. There would be sometimes 20 or 30 writers on a single film in classic Hollywood who went uncredited, and of course trying to figure out what Wilder may have done and films he may have contributed to that are not credited. So if you go on the IMDb for Wilder, you won't see all these films he did as a screenwriter just working away in the Hollywood system, but he did have his hand in them, and that did contribute to his experience, as did his very important work as a newspaperman in Germany and his work in German films, and especially the film People on Sunday, and also he did an adaptation of Emil and the Detectives, those being the two key films of his time in Germany that helped to sort of formulate his emerging style, which grew over time and really, I think, got crystallized by his early years in Hollywood, getting partnered with Charles Brackett, and then that team getting partnered with Ernst Lubitsch for Bluebeard's Eighth Wife, and finally Ninotchka, which was the masterpiece they made together. So, again, this is indispensable. It is well worth every penny of the $40 price tag. It is quite hefty, and I really must say I have to commend the printing job on this, because it's easy to hold in the hand. It's nicely bound, but it is, a 600-page academic biographical work that, it's really well done. So it will last many, many rereads and pulling off the shelf and thumbing through it for something you were trying to remember. And I also like that they have printed here the drawing of the camera that McBride uses to break up the several sections in the book. There are a handful of stills in here as well, but they are primarily done at the start of the chapters. So they are for the time periods that are covered in the chapters, but there isn't like a typical glossy photo section in the center like you'll get in most biographies. And again, I think that's a greater sign that this is a fully academic-minded work. This is something meant for posterity, but also it's trying to give a sense of the man himself. And what I find most interesting is like how he had met with John Ford and met with Frank Capra. McBride actually met Wilder more than once and actually talked with him and got a sense of who the person was, not just in the typical oh, I'm a film critic, and now I can ask you, 30 different questions, most of which you've probably answered at some point before. Also, McBride does not sugarcoat things. He gives you the good and the bad. He gives you the ups and downs, and he gives you his own personal reading of the man himself instead of just the artist and the public figure, which he's able to do because, of course, he knew Wilder to an extent, and again, not just from simply doing interviews, but having lunches and going to his office and things like that. So that, I think, also adds another layer of texture to this book. This book, again, is not just about the films, and it's not a straightforward biography, but it's trying to get under the skin of the legend, of the stories that we hear, and the wonderful interviews that Wilder would give, and his anecdotes and his quips. I think Wilder is without question the funniest man who ever lived, and I challenge anyone to name anyone funnier than Wilder was, because again, I don't think anyone in history has ever had a greater understanding of the gray area that is human existence. But as beautiful as he could be as an interviewee, and as a wit and as a writer, getting to the actual person underneath, and again, that sense of bruised romanticism that I've always felt runs deeply through every single Wilder picture. I've thought that ever since I was a kid and I first saw The Apartment and Double Indemnity, and then Sunset Boulevard, which absolutely changed my life. But it's that sense that I think makes the book most rewarding. And of course, you are, essentially reading this as a Wilder fanatic, and it's like having a 600-page discussion with a true expert on the subject. And again, while you may not agree with every single point that McBride makes, every point is well researched, well thought out, and well presented enough that you can understand why he's making that point, and the parallels he draws from the work to Wilder's own personal life and his tumultuous early years and what that would do to a person. So I do think if there is one Wilder book to reread many times over, it is this new book from Joseph McBride, which is unquestionably the book of the year 2021. This was a book that, as soon as it was announced, I was over the moon. I was over the moon reading it, and the only sad part is that it ended. I mean, that's it. I could have a whole second volume of this. And again, he did his book on Lubitsch, How Did Lubitsch Do It?, which, as he says in the foreword to this book, his original idea was to write a Lubitsch and Wilder book because the two are so closely linked, and Wilder was such a Lubitsch disciple for his entire life that you can feel the Lubitsch influence all over Wilder's work, even though Wilder had a grittier viewpoint and a tougher background and had a complete different working style. But the core spirit of the Lubitsch touch that's so famous is inherent in Wilder's viewpoint, and I think he recognized it, and that's why he admired Lubitsch so much. But McBride says again in the foreword to this book that in starting that, he had so much material, and he realized that their viewpoints were, while they had their similarities that were very strong, they were entirely different, that they really deserved their own books, and I think that was the right way to go. His Lubitsch book is unbelievably amazing. It is an absolute must-read, even if you're not too familiar with Lubitsch outside of his most famous films like Shop Around the Corner, To Be or Not to Be, and Ninotchka. Like Wilder, every Lubitsch film is beyond worth its weight in gold. Even the films that are not considered great successes, or his earlier films in Europe, Wilder I feel the same way about. And of course, I've been a Billy Wilder fan, and fan is short for fanatic. I've been a Wilder fanatic since I saw the first Wilder films that came across my path: Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard, and especially The Apartment. Again, I find it impossible to choose a favorite Wilder film. If I had to, it would probably be between Ace in the Hole and The Apartment, which I feel are the the two different poles of how far Wilder could go. Ace in the Hole is the darkest film he ever made, the first film he made away from Charles Brackett. It is, I think, the most scathing indictment of American society ever produced in the motion picture medium, and I just am so happy that it's available on home video now, and people actually know the film and have seen it and been obliterated by it, as I am every time. Whereas The Apartment is the multifaceted, richly textured work of the mature artist. It is the good and the bad. It is, it has elements of the silent film classic The Crowd, along with a great message, deeply felt comedy and emotion. A film that deals with repressed emotions and loss of the sense of self and the soul in our business-oriented world and society, and of course is absolutely hysterical. It's a film that is entirely about gray areas. That's why it's probably the most realistic holiday film ever made, because it's about essentially that life sucks and continues to suck, and it's how one learns to deal and live with that. And so I find that's maybe the best representation of the Wilder career, of what he could do. Ace in the Hole is the darkest film he ever made, and I think The Apartment is the most multifaceted and textured and the greatest realization of Wilder's own touch. It has nods to the Lubitsch touch in there, but it has Wilder's vision. It's Wilder's touch. It's not trying to do Lubitsch. It's Wilder finding his own footing, again with I.A.L. Diamond co-writing the film. It is the perfect cocktail of Wilder's themes, I think. And so, but even with all that, everybody has their own favorite, and I don't think Wilder made a bad picture. I just don't. There are films that aren't quite successful, they don't quite click, but you can see why he wanted to make them. And as with any great artist, there is no bad or minor work, but you can study every film and find new things in it. A Foreign Affair is a great example. McBride talks about A Foreign Affair a lot. You can tell it's one of his favorites in Wilder's canon, but it's not a film that's often discussed. It's a film full of ideas that is, again, extremely multifaceted, particularly Wilder going back to bombed-out Berlin right after the end of the war, and all of the emotions that must have brought to the surface, having escaped where the rest of his family did not and were unfortunately murdered, and what that does to a person, then going back and essentially making a comedy in bombed-out Berlin that, again, is all about gray areas. So it's a comedy with a setting and feeling that almost feels like The Third Man, but a year before, even though it's Germany and not Vienna, of course. But Wilder was full of paradoxes like that. And, of course, I do think he was the funniest man who ever lived, because his entire viewpoint and his body of work, whether as a newspaperman, whether as a screenwriter or a director or just a general intelligent being, was about life is a gray area. There is no escaping that. So that is why McBride's book on Wilder, Dancing on the Edge, I think is a must-own, a must-read. You're going to come back to this many, many times. It is beyond worth the $40 price tag, and it is, for me, the best book of 2021, fiction or nonfiction. I couldn't put this thing down, and I can't wait to reread it. So this is a must for Wilder fanatics. If you haven't gotten it already, or if you haven't, thought of getting it, or you hadn't heard of it, please do yourself a favor. McBride has really made the Wilder tome. Again, this is probably a good companion piece if you want a more traditional biography. Get a copy of Ed Seekoff's great On Sunset Boulevard, and then dig back into Wilder's filmography. See some of the lesser-known titles that maybe you haven't before. There are some great Blu-ray releases of Wilder's films now. Kino Lorber has been digging further into the Wilder catalog, so even films like The Emperor Waltz is now available on Blu-ray, and that was relatively obscure. And Eureka Masters of Cinema has done some great releases in Britain, and of course Criterion has done Ace in the Hole. So most of the Wilder catalog does have a good, solid edition. I still, of course, dream one day of somehow discovering, or someone discovering, the Roadshow original uncut version of Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which remains the greatest Sherlock Holmes film ever made, and is one of the great tragedies of cinema that that film was butchered in the way that it is. But still, the theatrical version we have is a masterpiece and the great Sherlock Holmes film in any case. So I heartily recommend any Wilder film that you maybe haven't seen or haven't seen in a while. I think he made so many masterpieces. He is one of the great artists of motion pictures, just one of the great artists in general, and one of the most interesting human beings who has ever lived. So that's why I'm so happy that Joseph McBride wrote Dancing on the Edge, his study of Billy Wilder, the best book of 2021.